It starts. Hello, testing. Can everybody hear okay? All right. I am just so thrilled to see so many people here today to welcome our preacher and our presenter today for adult education, Dr. William Yu. As you know from Pastor Charlie, he is here today preaching and also here for our class. And I am just so pleased. As many of you know, in our Racist Anonymous Fellowship group, we studied his book this summer. And I just, even after being at the 9 o'clock service, feel like there's so many insights to have him here at our church today. So let's bow our head in just a quick prayer just to say thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, God, for your blessings and being with us today. And please welcome Dr. William Yu. Amen.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you all at Covenant for allowing me to be here with you all. Thank you for the invite to Madison and to do all of this. So I'm going to share a little bit on the gospel paradox in American Christianity. Some of it will come from my recent book that came out about a year ago, and some of it is from ongoing research on the history of the abolition movement within and beyond the Presbyterian tradition. So with that, though, let me begin with something that comes from the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon. Dr. Cannon was a womanist theologian and the first African-American woman to be ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1974. About 13 years later, in 1987, Dr. Cannon once asked, where was the church and the Christian believers when Black women and Black men, Black boys and Black girls were being raped, sexually abused, lynched, assassinated, castrated, and physically oppressed? What kind of Christianity allowed white Christians to deny basic human rights and simple dignity to Blacks, these same rights which had been given to others without question, end quote. In 1836, approximately 250 commissioners from across the northern and southern states gathered in Pittsburgh for the annual meeting of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. PCUSA, no parentheses hereafter. Okay, sorry, y'all. That's good. So then the PC in the USA, so we know that there have been numerous denominations and divides and reunions. The most recent one was in 1983, when the then UPC-USA, United Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, and the Presbyterian Church in the United States. So that was the Southern Presbyterian denomination that had divided in 1861. So in 1861, there was a PCUSA, and they called themselves PCUSA Old School. There was also a New School. And then there was a Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America, PCCSA. After the Civil War, the PCCSA needed a new name. And so they said, we're going to be the Presbyterian Church in the United States, but no America, because that was already taken. So for many years, we had a PCUSA and a PCUS. And then there was also a UPCNA, which was a largely Scots-Irish Presbyterian denomination, really in Ohio and Western Pennsylvania, where it's kind of hub. And that reunited with the PCUSA in 1956. So that's why it was not the PCUSA and PCUS that reunited, but the UPCUSA and the PCUS that reunited in 1983. And so one more thing is that in the late 1960s, early 1970s, in the PCUS, the Southern denomination, there was a lot of rumbling, a lot of discontent over probably 3 issues that really can be boiled down to 2 issues. One was that there was some rumbling because some representatives wanted to reunite with the larger kind of national denomination, the UPC-USA. And so that was something, no, we want to remain our own denomination. But 2, the larger things were, one is that they were aware that they were increasing momentum in the UPC-USA to ordain women as ruling and teaching elders. and there was increasing momentum to get more involved in racial justice and to support the civil rights movement. So there finally, in 1973, there was a division in that southern denomination, PCUS. And so this more conservative group, they too needed a new name. So they said, PCUSA is taken, PCUS is taken. We're going to take that A, America. We are the Presbyterian Church in America. So there was a PCA, and it still resides today. It is probably the second largest Presbyterian denomination in the United States. If the PCUSA, our denomination, has 1.1 million members, they have approximately 350,000 members, I believe. Numbers are always hard because it's self-reporting, but that's where we are. So that's all of that. So then in 1983, when the PCUSA reunited, they too said, new wines need new wineskins, and we got to figure this all out. We need a whole new name to chart forward. So they said, we're going to be the Presbyterian Church and new novelty, parentheses, USA. That parentheses had never been there before. So all this to say, now we're in 1836. And so here the PCUSA is meeting. It's the largest Presbyterian denomination in the nation then, approximately 220,000 members, a little over 2,800 congregations. And so what they knew is that they would have to grapple with slavery, and I'll explain why in a minute. On May 19th, the meeting began, the General Assembly meeting, at 11 a.m. in the morning. You can kind of see it there in the minutes, with a sermon. And as was their tradition then, the opening sermon was given by the previous year's moderator, and they met annually. And so the moderator was the Reverend William W. Phillips, pastor of First Presbyterian in New York City. And he preached from Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, a text emphasizing that Christians must not be ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it implored the just to live by faith. Yet what I find is that some Presbyterians were in fact deeply ashamed of their denomination's reluctance to participate in movements for the emancipation of, at that point, a little over 2 million enslaved Black persons. But 1835, Presbyterian Ohio, the Chillicothe Presbytery, they sent a letter to other presbyteries beseeching them to adopt its resolutions on slavery. The members of the Chillicothe Presbytery, they were aware that some of their fellow Presbyterians, including in northern states that had already abolished slavery, either demurred on or outright declined to address slavery. One reason they gave is that it was a political matter outside the spiritual jurisdiction of the church. In response, the Chillicothe Presbytery found slavery to be, in their words, a heinous sin and scandal. And they demanded action from all Presbyterians because they believed that the church capital C, our purity and our prosperity, that's what's at stake. So one of this Presbytery's most controversial measures was more stringent disciplinary actions against slave-owning members. They said, here's one thing we can do. We can't abolish slavery in the nation, but we can say no enslavers are permitted to take communion at the Lord's table in our congregations. And this was controversial. The suspension from the Lord's Supper, which was then and now a significant sacrament in the Reformed and Presbyterian tradition, was quite a powder keg. You can see there on the slide, in 1818, the General Assembly and the Chillicothe Presbyterian noted this. We've already got the right words. Now we just need the right actions. We've got the right words. They already declared then, the commissioners, when they met in Philadelphia, that the voluntary enslaving on one part of the human race by another, they said it's a gross violation of human rights, and not kind of, but totally irreconcilable with the spirit and principles of the gospel of Christ. But here's the thing, in that same recommendation, in that same statement, right after they said slavery, totally irreconcilable, gross violation, they said, hey, let's have forbearance, forbear harsh censures against enslavers. And the same resolution in the next paragraph. Let's be kind, let's be compassionate. Let's think about acting Christ-like as they understood it toward the enslavers and those supporters of slavery in our denomination. And so you can imagine, and they said it then, this kind of resolution with strong words, but also a call to forbearance, kind of led to a muddle soup where there was no action against slavery and no actions for emancipation. So this produced the kind of Christianity that the Chillicothe Presbyterian and other Presbyterians said, no more. We can't do this anymore. So the commissioners in 1836, here's how they knew that they would have to engage slavery. The previous year in 1835, a memorial on the subject of slavery signed by 198 persons was presented in the General Assembly. And what they did, and what we do today, is they referred it to a committee of 5 white ministers. And Samuel Miller, a professor at Princeton Seminary, served as the chairperson of this committee. But one member, James Dickey, was from the Chillicothe Presbyterian. Miller was an enslaver, and he embodied the kind of Christianity that other Presbyterians, those supporting abolition, could no longer tolerate. Here's why. Miller acknowledged that, yes, there were sinful actions within slavery, but Miller did not believe that slavery was in itself a heinous sin. And he looked to steer the committee toward compromise. He didn't want the committee to strongly praise slavery as divinely ordained in the best way that God has, as some of the Southern colleagues wanted. He was a little bit ashamed and said, that's not what we want to do. But he did not also want the committee to support abolition as a righteous cause from God. So what is this kind of middle way, this compromised way? What can we do about it? But Professor Miller needed help. He was not sure, even though he knew he had the votes in his committee. And it ended up being 4-1, with James Dickey from Chillicothe being the dissenter. He knew that the committee alone could not perhaps stop the rising tide of abolitionism in his beloved denomination. So he turned to his colleague, Charles Hodge at Princeton Seminary. By 1836, Hodge had acquired a reputation as one of the most renowned Christian theologians in the United States. In 1825, he founded a theological journal that gained enormous influence among its Presbyterian readership, as well as intellectual elites across other academic disciplines. He wrote numerous articles about the Bible, Reformed theology, and ecclesial matters within the PCUSA. But Hodge had never written about slavery. Though Hodge was an enslaver himself, he was able to remain publicly silent on slavery for several years. He, like other white Presbyterians, took refuge in that non-binding declaration from 1818 that denounced slavery in principle but recommended no disciplinary action. But the stirrings of Black liberation forced Hodge's hand. Hodge understood that abolitionists in the denomination saw that General Assembly meeting in Pittsburgh in May 1836 as an opportunity to move the PCUSA toward a more actionable polity on slavery, such as, what if they take more seriously the Chillicothe Presbyterian's recommendation of banning enslavers from the communion table? So Hodge published his first essay on slavery 1 month before the General Assembly gathered. Hodge argued in this essay, here's how we got to figure out what to do about slavery. We got to go back to the Bible. And he observed that according to the Bible and the first century Greco-Roman world in which Jesus and the apostles lived, there are no denunciations of slavery as necessarily and universally sinful. That's not there in the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible that pronounces, in Hodge's kind of articulation, that all enslavers were men stealers and robbers, and consequently to be excluded from the church and the kingdom of heaven, end quote. So he's saying that's not in there. Instead, when we turn to the holy pages of Scripture in the New Testament, what do we see? We actually see precepts and regulations and recommendations for how to be good Christian masters and good Christian slaves. And at one point he says, writing to the slaves, but not really, writing to his audience, he says, look, let's say there's a perfect religious equality in Hodge's words. Let's say enslaved people become Christians. After you become Christian, don't use that as a reason, as a plea for your liberation and freedom. Instead, use that as a way to be more obedient to your, especially if they're also Christian, your Christian enslaver. So that's kind of what he wrote. And then finally, and you've kind of got it there, what he says is actually, these abolitionists, how dare they? One, not only are they incorrectly interpreting the Bible, but they're actually using the Bible as the main basis, some of them, the Christian ones, for their claims, and that they are usurpers in Hodge's words, that they are trying to claim the authority of Jesus Christ and the apostles, the authors of our religion, not their religion, but our religion, right? To appeal to the New Testament in their struggle for liberation. So that's what Hodge wrote, and what you'll see here is what happened, and it makes total sense. Although I think this is a history, as I shared with some of you yesterday, that was hidden in plain sight. Instantly, Hodge's article was widely circulated, frequently quoted, and reprinted in several formats, including in a pamphlet, how convenient, that was distributed on the floor of the General Assembly in Pittsburgh in 1836. One historian argues that Hodge published in the Princeton Review and in separate pamphlets perhaps the most important and instructive contributions toward the formation of a national pro-slavery ideology. In part, it was because white Presbyterians in the southern states and other white Christians too, they praised Hodge for in their view, the scriptural precision and theological clarity that he had demonstrated in his book. And also, thinking culturally, politically, and socially, they delighted that their best theologian at their flagship seminary in a northern free state was writing and saying these things to support slavery. Because of the racial power structures in the larger denomination, as well as the scourge of anti-Black racism in the United States, white Presbyterians, some of them, they publicly protested Hodge's article, whereas Black Presbyterians, they fumed more quietly and privately aligned with the white abolitionists. Two examples. One is Garrett Smith, a very wealthy white Presbyterian industrialist and landowner in New York. He railed against Hodge for defending slavery on biblical grounds, despite acknowledging its many sins of physical and spiritual abuse against enslaved persons. He mocked Hodge for lending his authority as a, quote, professor of theology to support slavery in his polished but pernicious article on slavery. Bariah Green, a white Presbyterian pastor teaching in higher education, attributed the inaction at the General Assembly meeting, you can see it there in 1836, directly to Hodge and Hodge's article there. The Rice will be calling him, "This is the work of our Princeton prophet." Indeed, the two professors, Miller and Hodge, succeeded in their mission. You can see there the commissioners in 1836 ultimately decided that the question of slavery be indefinitely postponed. And you can see the three reasons there why. 2 weeks after his sermon, exhorting fellow Presbyterians to practice their faith, unashamed ambassadors of the gospel, I went to look at the minutes. How did William W. Phillips vote on this? He too voted in favor of this indefinite postponement on any discussion and decision regarding slavery. In the aftermath, what happened for some abolitionists who were attuned to what was going on in American Protestantism, they therefore condemned white Presbyterians as the guiltiest perpetrators of slavery and fiercest opponents of Black liberation. Stephen S. Foster, a white Congregationalist and probably better known as the husband of Abby Foster Kelly, a more prominent activist for abolitionism and women's rights, he wrote in 1843 accusing Presbyterians of saying, "You're not only content with being enslavers and supporting slavery, but you are actually, in his view, the most active and energetic enemies of the abolition." It's one thing. Some of you own enslaved persons. It's another thing. Some of you support slavery. It's a whole other thing that some of you are actively attacking and denouncing abolitionism. But part of why that happened is because, especially after 1830, it's known as the second wave of abolitionism. The first wave was in the 1780s, in the founding of the country. They really did use religious and moral claims to advocate for abolition. So, in response, there needed to be more moral and religious claims against abolitionism. And so, increasingly, the odd thing is when you think about pro-slavery theology and anti-Black theology, it wasn't as if from 1780 to 1860, it was like on the decline. As people knew more, it's like chipping away, chipping away, chipping away. In fact, it was the inverse. As the abolition movement became more popular and was growing momentum after 1830, there were more pro-slavery writings, more anti-Black theology in response to. So much of it was a response to abolitionism. Now, on the one hand, it can be understood that some, not all, but some Christians who were defending slavery, they didn't really, maybe perhaps like Kant, they didn't really want to get involved in the battle of the press and writing a lot about it. But the abolitionists forced their hand. If you're saying, God damn slavery, we got to figure out a way to get at that, get back at that. And so that was kind of what is going on. And so Foster stated in 1843 in this book, The Brotherhood of Thieves, True Picture of the American Church and Clergy, no sect in the land has done more to perpetuate slavery than this. So what I write, and some of you have read it, is, and I do think this is not the most novel part of my argument. So I write that, look, and it's trying to answer Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon's question, what kind of Christianity allowed this to all happen? The most obvious answer is the wrong kind of Christianity. It's like, okay. And so here I lean on Frederick Douglass, formerly enslaved man, escaped from slavery in around Baltimore, Maryland. And he wrote in his autobiographical narrative, which was a best-selling book that came out in 1845, saying, look, I love Christianity, but here's what I hate. I hate the corrupt, slave-holding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. So to some who said, you know, Douglas, Frederick, you seem to hate Christianity. You seem to hate the Christianity that's all around. He said, no. I love Christianity. Christianity is a good religion. I do hate the Christianity that seems to pervade and dominate in this country. So following his autobiography, he became one of the most prominent, as we all know, abolitionists, intellectuals, and kind of social reformers of the 19th century. He also criticized in his autobiography, noting the contradictions that existed between white Christians who love marriage and these are divine blessings that God has given to us, yet there were no such provisions to protect marriages and families in slavery, because enslaved people could be sold in auctions, sales, and transfers, and there was no way to protect a child or a parent or a spouse from being sold. And in particular, this happened in kind of last will, testament, and bequeathment. When an enslaver died, they had multiple children. Sometimes it would be some going to one, some going to another, or it would simply be all to be sold, as you'll see in a minute, and how that all worked out. So in the same year of Douglas's autobiography, 1845, I found this journal published by the Associate Reform Synod of the West. And so the West then, I think you all know, includes this region. It wasn't the West, but it really was Ohio and Kentucky and Illinois and Michigan and the like. And so in 1845, this journal came out, a reform journal, and I found that it criticized the seminary where I teach today. The seminary where I teach today is in Metro Atlanta, right outside the city of Atlanta. Until 1920, it started in 1828. It was in Columbia, South Carolina, hence the name that it moved. So it said, hey, you know what? In the Savannah Republican, there's this newspaper. Can you believe that there's a public auction and that human beings, enslaved people, are listed as property akin to animals, lands, and other capital? And so the journal was especially infuriated to behold that a Presbyterian seminary in the listing was there as the recipient of the funds derived from the sale. They found this as scandalous. So one level is terrible that human beings are being auctioned off in this way, as if no different than animals and lands. But at another level, how terrible that a seminary would be the ones to profit off of this sale. And so the wrong kind of Christianity, it is the most obvious answer to Dr. Cannon's question, but I maintain a more historically precise, honest answer is the Presbyterian kind of Christianity. I do find that some white Presbyterians actively participated in the enslavement of Black persons and more in the perpetuation of anti-Black racism. For example, individual members and a few congregations owned enslaved persons. All these Presbyterians unjustly profited off the uncompensated labor of enslaved persons. Some of these Presbyterians, as I'm going to get to in a minute, are also guilty of committing far greater crimes. Elizabeth Keckley, a formerly enslaved Black woman who emerged from slavery into freedom as a successful career as an artisan, including a stint working in the White House as a seamstress for First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. She wrote and recounted the cruel oppression she experienced from a family of Presbyterian enslavers. Keckley received her first beating at the age of 4, and she wrote that it was a lashing so severe that she never forgot the incident. More painful was when Keckley's father was separated from her and her mother to migrate westward in a sale to another enslaver. Quote, I can remember the scene as it were but yesterday, how my father cried out against the cruel separation, his last kiss, his wild straining of my mother to his bosom, the solemn prayer to heaven, the tears and the sobs, the fearful anguish of broken hearts, end quote. At 14, Keckley was separated from her mom to live with her enslaver son, a white Presbyterian pastor named Robert Burwell in Virginia. 4 years later, the Reverend Burwell moved to Hillsborough, North Carolina with his family, taking Keckley with them. And there she experienced physical abuse at the hands of both Burwell and a local white school principal who was a member of Burwell's congregation. At the behest of Burwell's wife, who sought to subdue what she regarded as Keckley's haughty spirit, Burwell and the school principal whipped Keckley on multiple occasions. The school principal also forcibly stripped Keckley naked. Shortly thereafter, Keckley was raped by another white man, Alexander Kirkland, resulting in her pregnancy and the birth of a child. So where am I going and why am I sharing all of this? I think in part, it is to demonstrate what Gerrit Smith, the white Presbyterian abolitionist and a businessman, contended in 1837 in his article against Charles Hodge. He noted that most white Christians in the northern states, we believe slavery is immoral, but we appeal to U.S. laws and politics to help soothe our consciences. Smith therefore confessed that a large portion of white Christians in the northern states, in his words, refused to take a stand against slavery. And the reason why was for social and economic reasons. Slavery was, as awful as it was, a foundational reality in their lives. And they preferred, according to Smith, the world as they knew it, even with the many evils of slavery and anti-Black racism, over the uncertainties of deconstructing their world and reconstructing a new one in closer accordance with the teachings of Jesus Christ. Hodge argued that, Charles Hodge talks a lot about the doctrine of biblical authority, but really it seemed to Smith that the doctrine that governs our lives was the doctrine of expediency. Isn't that a thing? It really struck out to many when he wrote that, the doctrine of expediency. Hodge's faculty colleague, Archibald Alexander, also a pivotal leader in the PCUSA. Older than Hodge, Alexander was the first professor at Princeton Seminary and elected moderator of the General Assembly, I think in 1809 or 1810. One sad example of expediency is found in Alexander's endorsement of the American Colonization Society, a popular movement in the 1800s centered in the northern states that endeavored to send free Black Americans to Liberia. And Alexander wrote in 1846, the reason why he supported it is because he felt that the discriminatory contempt that white Christians held against Black Americans was too insurmountable to overcome. In 1846, writing from Princeton, New Jersey, not the southern states, he noted that racism against African Americans, it is irrational. It is stupid. It is unreasonable. It is emotional. Yet he confessed it seems to be, again, insurmountable. He did not see a solution to it apart from supporting this expensive movement to send free Black Americans to Liberia, where they could be part of a new colony that the U.S. government and the like supported there. In a sense, he wrote that it's better if they can leave this country and find another home on the African continent where their skin color would not be so despised. So in response to that, in the ACF, this colonization movement, you had these two Black Presbyterians, really kind of heroes and pioneers, Theodore S. Wright, who was a student of Archibald Alexander and the first Black graduate of Princeton Seminary in 1828. And you had Samuel Eli Cornish, a multiracial, freeborn Black man who was pastor of one of the first Black Presbyterian congregations in New York City in the 1810s, 1820s. They got together in the 1830s. And so they wrote, say, we've got to figure out how to combat the ACS, this colonization movement. So you can see it there. They said the colonization movement, it's really bad. Lots of reasons why. One is, it seems to be an organization that is working for us, Black people, yet it has no Black people in its membership. And in part, they did not have any Black members because they were trying to persuade some white enslavers. So maybe if you want to free your slave, then send them to Liberia, we can do that. And they did not want Black members. That would raise suspicions that the colonization movement was really an abolition movement in disguise. So they said, look, if you consulted Black Americans, and they cited this event that happened in an African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia that Richard Allen was leading. They talked about the ACS, they talked about y'all, and they had a vote. How many are going to support the ACS? And not a single hand was raised. So the ACS said, we got to get on board with colonization in Liberia, because that's what Black people really, that's what they're yearning for in their hearts. They yearn in their hearts for Africa. That was kind of one of their slogans and taglines. And Cornish and Wright were like, no, you can ask us. What we yearn for in our hearts is equal access to education, employment, dignity, freedom, and life. That's really what we yearn for in our hearts. All of us, by that point in 1830, with the end of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, all of us are native born. And in fact, when you think about it, and this is current research, I'll get to it in a minute, but there are more, but in the 1860 census, less than 1% of immigration came from Africa and the Caribbean. The vast majority of immigration came from Europe, and that's not unfamiliar to us. And so that was what some abolitionists and particularly Black Americans found so repulsive to them, that you are denying us citizenship when we are the most native-born population in the United States, apart from indigenous communities. Yet, for every European immigrant who has a white skin color, yes, certainly there's discrimination, but they are guaranteed the right of citizenship, nearly from entry. So that was all what's going on. And you can see here, the bigger thing that I appreciate about Cornish and Wright, they did get into the legal stuff, but they said, for the ACS, it's really bad for Black people. But you know what else it's really bad for? It's really bad for Christianity. Because what you're really saying is that, okay, we're going to take the ACS, we're going to take you all to your theological conclusion that even the power of God and even the gospel and even repentance and even teaching white Christians, that is not enough to free us from anti-Black racism. The only thing that's going to free us from anti-Black racism, and you can see it there, is that the Atlantic Ocean could be made to roll between. That's what you're saying. And so that was what's going on. Whereas Cornish and Wright said, colonization in Liberia, that's not the solution. The solution to anti-Black racism is white repentance and is figuring out a way for us as two communities to work together. And so you had all that, and I'm going to move forward a little bit just because of time. And here's, interestingly, so what I'm finding in my current research is Black abolitionists, here's Sarah Parker Ramon, freeborn in Massachusetts. They, I don't want to say they had like a romantic view of England, Ireland, and Scotland, but when they went there, they did find, certainly there were some subtle and some forms of racism, but they did find that it was very different from the racism that was in the United States. And there in England, for some of them, and Scotland and Ireland too, they really found more freedom to speak more freely and reflect about Christianity in America and the like. And so here's Sarah Parker Ramon in 1859 in Warrington, England. She said, the United States, we got a lot of problems. She said 2 years ago, this is 1859, there was a decision, the Dred Scott decision. It was a 7-2 decision in the US Supreme Court. 5 of the justices are enslavers themselves, and only 2 of the other 4 justices dissented in this horrible majority opinion that denied citizenship to all Black people, slave or free. And she said, you know what though? You know what's worse than American politics? American churches. Infinitely more corrupt than American politics, in her words. Because she said there are roughly at that point, and she's really leaning on the 1850 census, roughly 350,000 enslavers, less than 2% of the US population. Yet she found and observed that they wielded their power over legislative, executive, and the judicial branches of the government. But not only that, To her, it seemed congregations, denominations, and all of Christianity itself that she saw in the United States. I do find that Ramon's insight aligns with something that I write about in the book. The English sociologist, kind of a pioneer known as the first woman in the field of sociology from England, Harriet Martineau. So she visited the United States in the 1830s, and she noted this kind of paradox. She said, you know what? Some of the best abolitionists and the best Christians I met were Presbyterian. Yet the institutional church, the denomination as she said it was so fiercely and thoroughly pro-slavery. How can it be that in this denomination, in this church in the United States, that there are some of the most noble abolitionists and some of the most vile enslavers and supporters of slavery, all in the same church? And so she wrote that. And here to note is that the executive committee of the AASS, the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was the biggest anti-slavery society in the United States, 1834, it started in 1831. It's pretty cool. Over half, at least 6 of these 12 men are Presbyterians, many of them ministers. 2 of them, you can see Samuel Eli Cornish and Theodore S. Wright, Black Presbyterian pastors there. So that is something that is very hopeful. At the same time, it's quite challenging because none of these men had any influence in the larger PCUSA denomination. They really were kind of rabble-rousers and outcasts. They were far more influential outside of the Presbyterian Church than within it. So we've really got to wrestle with that. That is the same, I'm wrestling with the same insight that Harriet Martineau is wrestling with. And I write in the book, when you look at the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, it's in Rochester, New York, there are a good number of individual Presbyterians that are inducted into that Hall of Fame. At the same time, none of them, as I understand it and as I see it, really had that much influence in the Presbyterian Church. And it was in part because of these commitments. So at one level, I was like, they really did find in Reformed theology, they did really find in the Presbyterian tradition that which motivated them to say slavery has to end today. Yet at the same time, there are others that said, not here and not with us. You can go do it outside of the church. And that is a kind of common theme, I think, when we look at some justice movements and kind of religion involved in it. So finally, I'm going to look at William Lloyd Garrison, the founder of the Liberator newspaper, and I'm going to get to his point about the gospel paradox, and we'll stop the questions. One is, let me just move forward. Here's William Lloyd Garrison, not a Presbyterian, not a mainstream kind of Protestant person, but again, probably the most significant white abolitionist in US history. And so here's what he wrote in 1838. He wrote, if you would make progress, you must create opposition. And this is him really responding to so many Protestant clergy and theologians who are criticizing him for his abrasive and confrontational rebuke of American Christianity and work for abolitionism. Array the father against the son, mother against the daughter. If you would save your reputation, lose it. It is a gospel paradox, yet nevertheless true. The more peaceable a man comes after pattern Christ, the more he is inclined to make a disturbance, to be aggressive, to turn the world upside down. And then 8 years later, in 1846, now writing to Reformed people, Presbyterians, he says, look, my tactics are actually the same as the early modern Protestant reformers. Aren't you guys the protesting faith? Aren't you guys for changing the world and reforming the world? You're the reformers. And he noted every great reform movement. He looked in Scotland at John Knox. He looked at Luther in Germany. He looked at Calvin in Geneva and in Paris before then. And he said, all of them, here's what they all have in common, including me: antagonism to public quietude and good order, and to make the whole social, political, and religious structure tremble to its foundations. In another part, he says, you know what I like about John Knox? He calls a spade a spade. He calls a fig a fig. I think he would call slavery what it is. And that famous speech that Frederick Douglass gave on July 5th, 1852, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. I read it again recently, and I found there too, even Douglass appeals to John Knox and says, what would John Knox do if the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 was passed in Scotland? Surely he would go around and mobilize and tell people, this is not the gospel, this is unjust. Garrison in 1861, he noted throughout his life, that he really found inspiration from this passage in Isaiah 58. Some of you may know it. To be a restorer of the breach, to be the repairer of the breach, restorer of the past that we dwell in. But he noted that it was not possible to be a repairer. It was not possible to be a restorer unless one was also a disturber of the peace. That's what he called the liberator, or the other name I get from my newspaper, disturber of the peace. So that was really what was going on. And so let me end with this, and I'm sorry for time. But it is quite beautiful. It is so at the end of the Civil War in April 1865, with Confederate defeat all but sure, Garrison actually made his first visit with Henry Ward Beecher and other politicians to Charleston, South Carolina. It was a city in which his likeness and writings were burned in a public protest 30 years prior. And he joined in a celebration at Zion Presbyterian Church, a congregation with over 1,500 formerly and now free Black members. A great crowd gathered to hear Garrison and others speak. As soon as everyone was seated, one Black man, Samuel Dickerson, approached the pulpit with his two young daughters to give Garrison a wreath of flowers. Dickerson explained, quote, "I have read of you. I have read of the mighty labors you have had for the consummation of this glorious object. Here you stand before you, your handiwork." Dickerson then told Garrison of how his enslaver had sold one of his daughters and threatened to sell the other, before stating, quote, "I tell you, it is not this heart alone, but there are mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers, the pulsation of whose hearts are unimaginable. The greeting that they would give you, sir, it is almost impossible for me to express. We thank you for what you have done for us." After the crowd cheered, William Lloyd Garrison responded, quote, "My dear friend, I have no language to express the feelings of my heart on listening to your kind and strengthening words, on receiving these beautiful tokens of your gratitude, and on looking into the faces of this vast multitude, now happily liberated from the galling letters of slavery. Let me say at the onset, not unto us, but unto God be all the glory for what has been done in regard to your emancipation. I've actively engaged in this work for almost 40 years. And when I began, I was quite young, to plead the cause of the enslaved in this country. But I never expected to look you in the face, never supposed you would hear of anything I might do on your behalf. I knew only one thing, all that I ever wanted to know, that you were a grievously oppressed people, and that in every consideration of justice, humanity, and right, you are entitled to immediate and unconditional freedom." Quote. Garrison understood that day that the task of abolishing slavery was complete and something to celebrate, but he continued in his speech that the work of justice would need to continue as Black and white Americans reconstructed their society and their nation toward a greater love and a more perfect liberty for all to flourish. The gospel paradox would persist. Christians then, and I believe Christians today, were confronted with William Lloyd Garrison's challenge. Will we practice the kind of Christianity that fulfills God's call in Isaiah 58? Right before that verse about repairing the breach, it says, to undo the heavy burdens, to break every yoke, and then it adds, to restore the streets of dwelling. That's our challenge too. And I pray and hope that we learn from our history and we get involved in the good work that women and men like William Lloyd Garrison started over 200 years ago. Thank you.
We have some time for a few questions and then I'm gonna have to rush them off. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
And with the caveat that I haven't yet read the book, you had talked about the sort of practical economic justifications that were given by Hodge and others in the mid-19th century. What about the theological context? Hodge was a very strict Calvinist. He was a strong proponent of penal substitutionary theory. And how much of that, which now we see oftentimes in the mainstream of the evangelical church, how much of that played a role in our tolerant or pro-slavery aspects, by abolition aspects of the position?
Oh yeah, again, that's always hard to know. There is a kind of chicken and egg quality to all of that. I do think certainly the challenge of biblical literalism is that it was not possible to be entirely literal. And in fact, even them as strict Calvinists, strict interpreters of the Bible, they recognize actually that the New Testament covenant abrogated, in their words, ended some of the Old Testament laws and regulations, that we have a new covenant in Christ. And so they certainly did wrestle with what kinds of precepts and what kind of laws to follow and what to disregard, such as dietary laws from the Hebrew Bible. And so all of that came into play. So certainly a lot of that, it does the context of all of that, as they understood it, really was what creates a good, faithful social. So they really argued a lot in the scriptures as they understood it, and it got harder to argue after the Civil War, but they certainly tried. It was this idea that we have this order that children obey parents, that wives obey husbands. And we're like, on that, but that was there, and slaves obey masters. Like, in the same time, certainly the gospel has radical teachings, but these are the foundations of the church as the Pauline epistles teach. So you can't, they said it was a slippery slope. You can't take one without the other. Now, what they did add, even before the Civil War and after, were certainly about white superiority and black inferiority. That was another kind of leg to that foundation. But so they wrestled with all that. And I do think a lot of that, though, comes in, and what abolitionists and what others pointed out is that it is the power of self-interest. It is what Samuel Eli Cornish noted. Like, for all of you take comfort in that. That's not what the poor take comfort in. And he said, what if there was a religion, and I think here he is attacking his Presbyterian Church, that said all red-haired people God created inferior to non-red-haired people? How many Scots would say, this is the religion for me? And so, but the point he was trying to make is that all of us are reading into, and so we've got to find ways to move past them. So that's how I would answer it. And so, and there are still continually today conservative evangelical notes that want to hold to some measure of literalism while also critiquing the interpreter and the interpreter's context. And so all of that really, the challenge is, all of that happens in community. It is for Protestants, what one of my former professors has said, the blessings and the problems of having a paper pope in the Bible, right? Whereas other traditions, the Orthodox and the Catholics, they do have human hierarchies that not that everyone follows. I think birth control is a good example in Roman Catholicism in the 19th and 20th century, right? But yeah, so that's where kind of for Protestants, that's what we continue to wrestle with. Yeah. We're gonna get there. One last comment I'll say we gotta worship is I found this just before I got on that plane here. So Henry Ward Beecher, I think we all know he was pastor of Second Presbyterian in Indiana, Plymouth Church in New England. You know, he conceded, like, William Lloyd Garrison, I thought he was wrong. I thought he was going about it the wrong way for so long. Like, you know, and he said churches hated his abolitions. Like, the American people hated what he was doing. And I always thought he should be more conciliatory, that he should be nicer, that he should find ways to be more like persuasive. But in the end, that was what it took. He was right and I was wrong. And I think, and we don't know, I'm going to look into Beecher. I can't imagine what Henry Ward Beecher was thinking on that podium alongside William. I don't think anyone came to give him some flowers. I mean, he gave a sermon too at that address. But it is the challenge for us. Like, at one level, some have argued Garrison was a man ahead of his times. And maybe so. But another level, I want to say he lived in his time. And so certainly there are some of us that can live in our time and we can do what's right. And certainly we got to find ways in churches to do it where we're not offending everyone left and right. But at the same time, we too have got to find ways to speak the truth as we understand it and act and be willing to shake things up a little bit, if not a lot. So I think that's what racial justice and all other forms of justice are going to do. But anyway, sorry, all. Thank you, and I'll see some of you in the